Welcome again to our webinar, Securing a Future for Carbon Removal, the case for a government-led advanced market commitment. Thanks for joining us today to talk about this important topic. My name is Matt Kirley. I'm a manager in RMI's carbon dioxide removal initiative, focusing in policy and market development. Again, for your awareness, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted on our event page within 24 hours, along with other resources and information. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions you have into the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. This webinar will be an hour long with approximately 40 minutes for presentation and 20 minutes for questions. For those of you viewing this as a recording, please reach out to our team if you have any questions, and our contact information will be shared on the last slide of the presentation. Next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with RMI, we are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that transforms global energy systems through market-driven solutions to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. RMI has grown to more than 700 experts working on 4 continents. RMI's carbon dioxide removal initiative focuses on driving the science and innovation, early deployment, and policy and market development needed to scale this critical emerging technology. Next, I'll let our other presenters very briefly introduce themselves. First Isabel, then Danielle, and then Noah, who will lead us into the main presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel, and I'm an associate on the Carbon Dioxide Removal Initiative at RMI. I've been with the team for over 2.5 years, and over the course of this time, I've worked on our Applied Innovation Roadmap, our State CDR Atlas, the Scaling Greenhouse Gas Removal Roadmap, and now this AMC discussion paper. So long story short, I think a lot about road mapping carbon removal and carbon removal policy and markets. And I'm very excited to spend the next hour diving more deeply into the work that we've done on the advanced market commitment for carbon removal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Daniel Pike. I lead the carbon removal team and portfolio here at RMI. I've been in this role for 3 years now. It's been a pleasure to work across those different areas of science, innovation, early deployment, markets, and policy. And it's been a privilege this year to explore this concept with support of Noah Deich, who I will hand it over to now.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. It's great to be here. So my name is Noah Deich. I am a fellow with the RMI carbon removal team, but also a fellow with the Stripe Climate Program, where for the past year, I've been working to develop this idea and speaking with governments and stakeholders around the world about the concept of an AMC for carbon removal. I'm excited to kick off today, and maybe we could just jump right in on the next slide, please. The agenda that we want to lead folks through is really trying to place this idea in context, where it's coming from in terms of the broader history of the carbon removal field and how it's evolved over the past few years, but also the history of advanced market commitments and why this provides a helpful tool to think about carbon removal innovation, and specifically how governments can coordinate for that. We're going to get into the details of the report, which really provide a case for why governments should take action and start to create an advanced market commitment now. But then really thinking about how can we get this idea moving forward. The world has changed substantially in the year that we've been working on this project. We're kind of in the midst of macroeconomic, geopolitical realignments that are happening live. And so the question really becomes, how do we get something like this off the ground now? And what are the different opportunities to move forward? And so that's what we're going to be exploring. Next slide, please. All of the details for what we're going to be talking about come from this report. I think I want to acknowledge folks who are on this webinar and many others who contributed to it. We solicited feedback from hundreds of stakeholders across civil society, including NGOs and academics, businesses that were working on developing and purchasing carbon removal, as well as government stakeholders directly. And just very grateful for all of this input. It's all been synthesized into this report. And what we've tried to do in this report is not necessarily prescribe, here's exactly what a government-led AMC should look like, but really to say, here are all of the different design criteria that any government advanced market commitment for carbon removal will have to contemplate, and what some of the design considerations actually look like. So the idea is not to say, here is a finished product, but really to spark a conversation that can be guided by all of the key dimensions that a successful government advanced market commitment must navigate. And we're going to start to explore those in detail, starting on the next slide, please, with some of the motivation for this work, which is carbon removal is really at an inflection point. Over the past 10 years, there's been a Cambrian explosion in early stage research and development for carbon removal. We've seen the concept emerge from kind of academic settings into the top picture on the left, which are these giant CAD renderings for what carbon removal of the future could look like, and a ton of work to think about how we could design these systems for scale, how we could bring them down the cost curve, how we could design them to support communities and make sure that there's no unintended consequences, while also delivering benefits to workers and other local stakeholders. And so there's just been this enormous amount of exciting work. And we're now at the phase where pictures like the bottom right have started to emerge. This is the construction site for a direct air capture project that the company 1.5 is developing in West Texas. It should be online in the coming months and at hundreds of thousands of tons per year scale. This is an order of magnitude bigger than any of the previous direct air capture projects that are live today. And I think what's so powerful is you actually seeing real workers build real industrial scale facilities that we can start to understand. But the key thing is that these projects do not actually happen unless there is demand, that we need to create some sort of sustainable market for carbon removal. And unlike many of the other clean technologies that have preceded carbon removal in making their way to real industry that will matter for climate, carbon removal does not have that natural market like electricity or transportation, et cetera. And so it's incumbent on stakeholders from both the voluntary carbon market side and governments to figure out how we can create enough demand for early carbon removal projects to bring them from this picture that we see here on the left to the picture on the right, the artist rendering to the actual photo. And I think that that's what we're really talking about here is how can we get governments to come together and build on so much of the work that the private sector has started in a voluntary manner. But what everyone recognizes is that the scale required can get started by the private sector, but ultimately has to transition to governments and do so relatively quickly for us to actually sustain the scaling up and the cost downs for these solutions. And to make sure that when we talk about carbon removal, we're talking about it in an apples to apples manner when it comes to the standards and so forth. And so this is a project that's truly near and dear to my heart. It's something that we had considered a lot in the Biden administration about how our domestic carbon removal work could fit into this broader global ecosystem. And I think now the timing is really opportune to think about how we can go further together as a global community of policymakers and of voluntary corporate purchasers all working together in a public-private partnership to scale carbon removal. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt to just give a little bit more context, but very eager to share more about this effort with you and continue the conversation beyond. So Matt, over to you.
All right, thanks for that great overview, Noah. Before we get into the details of the report, I'm going to step back just a bit and introduce carbon removal as a concept. Next slide, please. So the IPCC defines carbon removal as anthropogenic activities removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably storing it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in products. And that's very technical, but next slide, please. We know that what that ends up meaning is that carbon removal can be a lot of different things. We know carbon removal can be achieved by many different types of these anthropogenic activities. It's not just growing trees. It's not just creating giant vacuums for the sky. There's a large number of pathways, for example, for processing biomass into biochar or bio-oil or burying biomass. There are a number of ways to use alkaline minerals, for example, crushing them up and enhancing their natural weathering processes to capture CO2. And we can also capture CO2 to use in building products, both biomass-based or mineral-based. Many of these, or all these methods are at a varying level of maturity. And it's important to keep that in mind as we discuss a CDR, carbon removal AMC. Next slide, please. We also know that we need to achieve net zero and then net negative emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And therefore, in addition to drastic emissions reductions, carbon removal will be an important part of the full solution set to reduce net emissions in the near term, address continuing emissions at net zero, and draw down historical emissions in the long term. Next slide, please. There is significant debate over exactly how much carbon removal will be needed by mid-century. And to illustrate this in the paper, we looked at carbon removal through the analogy of wind and solar energy. Both of these industries grew very, very fast over the course of 25 years. Wind at a 17% annual growth rate and solar at a mind-boggling 39% annual growth rate. We thought of these as very optimistic benchmarks for carbon removal, although there are some very important differences, including wind and solar energy, where technology is feeding into a huge existing market, whereas carbon removal is starting from scratch. Also, electricity provides utility to individual users, whereas carbon removal is a public good. So these growth rates may not be achievable in carbon removal, but again, using these as benchmarks for what could we optimistically achieve in scaling this industry. Next slide, please. Given these large ranges of endpoints and scaling rates, and assuming carbon removal is unlikely to scale as fast as wind and solar, we've estimated that carbon removal should be deployed at 100 million tons per year by 2035 to reach mid-century targets, which could cost in the range of $20 billion per year. For reference, the Frontier AMC is in the process of purchasing $1 billion worth of durable carbon removal over 8 years. So the bottom line is that for a range of possible beliefs about the ultimate scale of carbon removal needed and possible industry growth rates, demand for carbon removal is not on track to meet the need at mid-century. Next slide, please. It's also important to note challenges that the carbon removal industry faces beyond demand. Many early approaches face high costs currently, measurement uncertainty, and a lack of regulations. More novel methods are likely needed. Society needs to be able to trust the safety of carbon removal approaches and that they're having the impact that is claimed. And standards around the globe are currently fragmented and in need of alignment. So overall, carbon removal has an important role today to play in our future world, but several critical challenges, including demand, are holding the industry back. So I'll now hand things over to Isabel to discuss the role that an AMC could play alongside other interventions in closing these gaps.
Thanks, Matt. So now that Matt has talked a little bit about what carbon removal is, how much is needed, and the gaps that exist, I'm going to walk through the other large component of this work, advanced market commitments, or AMCs. Next slide. To start, in this paper, we define an AMC as a financial mechanism designed to stimulate the development and deployment of new technologies by guaranteeing a future market for them. The goal of an AMC is to ensure that a market will exist for a product so that the suppliers of that product are able to innovate and develop with assurance that they will have someone to sell it to. So a key word here is the word advance. An AMC guarantees funds in advance of a product being delivered. Next slide. So this slide shows a variety of examples of advanced market commitments. So to start, I want to talk through the one that's shown in the bottom left, the report titled Making Markets for Vaccines. This is the report that kickstarted the process for the development of the pneumococcal vaccine advanced market commitment. This AMC leveraged donor funding through both government commitments and philanthropic support to incentivize vaccine manufacturers to not only innovate and create vaccines that would be well suited to specific geographies, but also incentivize manufacturers to scale operations and to produce a number of vaccines that could be rolled out to a variety of lower income countries that would usually not have had access to these vaccines as quickly or at the scale that was made possible through this advanced market commitment. So this is one example of an AMC that exists in a different industry. However, an example that those on this call might be more familiar with is Frontier Climate. So as Matt mentioned, Frontier is an AMC made up of corporates to buy $1 billion of permanent carbon removal by the year 2030. Next slide. So I'm now going to walk through the core argument of this paper, which is the case for a government-led AMC for carbon removal. Next slide. Earlier, Matt discussed key gaps that carbon removal faces, and those gaps are shown again on this slide. The need to reduce costs, to deploy and fund carbon removal, and so on. The green rows, so cost reduction, deployment, funding, and standards, are all gaps that an AMC is likely to be able to fill. The yellow rows, so global development, innovation, measurement, and societal trust, are gaps that an AMC might be able to fill depending on how it's designed and operated. And the red row, shared infrastructure, is a gap that an AMC is unlikely to be able to fill for one reason or another that we'll discuss more later on. So as you can see, it's possible for an AMC to fill almost every one of the key gaps that Matt pointed out earlier, which is really the crux of the argument for this paper. Depending on its focus and design, it may be able to fill more of the key gaps than others, and that's something that we'll discuss in more detail in the coming slides. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk through another component of the argument, which is why did we focus specifically on an AMC being led by multiple governments? So to start, governments are trusted entities for things like standards creation. Additionally, they could drive additional private investment by sending a credible demand signal, de-risking offtakes, and providing a reference point on standards and practices for the voluntary market. So governments are really important actors here for this work for a variety of reasons. Additionally, governments could be centrally coordinated around priorities and a vision of carbon removal through this advanced market commitment. So this really provides a venue for multiple governments to align around standards, research and policy priorities, and the necessary steps to create a harmonized global market. Although governments vary in actions that they've taken thus far, and some have made real progress on supporting carbon removal, an AMC would provide a venue to really coordinate multiple governments and create a vision for the world and for the future of carbon removal. Next slide. So we've been talking a lot about the key gaps that the carbon removal industry faces, and specifically how an AMC could fill them. However, it's important to note that an AMC should be created in tandem with other mechanisms. It shouldn't stand alone. And so this table shows 10 different mechanisms, and it really maps how they might be able to fill these key gaps that we've identified. For more information on these ratings, you can explore the appendix of the discussion paper for an explanation of each of these columns, so each of these mechanisms, and really why we decided to rate them as well-suited to filling the gap, possibly well-suited, or likely not well-suited. So one thing that I wanted to come back to is the fact that an AMC is unlikely to support shared infrastructure or infrastructure that would be spurred by the creation of like multiple projects utilizing that same infrastructure. So something like CO2 pipelines. While an AMC is unlikely to fill this gap, there are other mechanisms like supply side incentives, industrial hubs, and regional planning that are likely to fill this gap. And so this is just one example of how these mechanisms should work in tandem with each other and really complement each other, but that overwhelmingly a government-led AMC is an important tool to add to this toolbox. Next slide. So as mentioned, the impacts of an AMC and its ability to fill these key gaps that we've been discussing will depend on its design and its operation. So these categories on the left hand, starting with market definition, are some examples of design categories and design choices that will have to be made. So for example, what types of carbon removal are eligible for the AMC? Who are eligible buyers and suppliers? Are only governments eligible to be buyers, or are others also eligible? How are standards and methodologies selected or created? Are they created from scratch? Are they adopted? Is there some other process to create standards and methodologies? How does procurement occur? And who's responsible for the different steps in this process, such as sourcing, diligencing, and contracting? I'm not going to go through each one of the rows because that would take a long time, but there is a place that you can explore each of these in more detail. If you go to the next slide. So in addition to the discussion paper, we also created 2 pieces of supplemental material that explores 100+ design options and implications for an advanced market commitment for carbon removal. So you can find this analysis on the same webpage as the discussion paper, which was just set in the chat, just by scrolling down and then clicking one of these buttons that is circled in red, either summary tables or a detailed spreadsheet. And you'll be able to explore over 100 design options and implications. Next slide. So I'm now going to walk through one example of a potential design category and the trade-offs associated with it before I hand the presentation over to Daniel, who will close out this presentation. So I'm going to start with the example of cross-border funding. So in an AMC, cross-border funding could be prohibited, allowed, encouraged, or required for its members. So when we discuss cross-border funding, what we mean is if a government or how a government deals with being able to fund carbon removal outside of its borders. So we've explored 4 scenarios here, as mentioned: prohibited, allowed, encouraged, and required. If I take just 2 scenarios as an example, then we'll be able to see the different trade-offs for a variety of AMC designs. So to start, If cross-border funding is prohibited, then this would mean that governments are not allowed to fund carbon removal outside of their borders. This could prohibit pooled funding mechanisms for an AMC. It would also likely reduce possibilities of reaching economies of scale, and it would likely impact AMC membership. So there might be some governments that decide that this is the preference and they would prefer for cross-border funding to be prohibited, and they'd be more likely to join. However, on the other hand, some countries may be precluded from joining if cross-border funding was prohibited because of natural resource constraints or other constraints. On the other hand, if cross-border funding is prohibited, this is likely the example of an AMC design that would be least complicated in terms of accounting complexity and operations complexity. On the other hand, a different scenario is if cross-border funding is encouraged but not required. So in this scenario, it would increase flexibility for members to decide where the carbon removal is they would like to support. And it would also potentially incentivize international flows of capital and incentivize creating a global market. On the other hand, it would likely increase accounting complexity for the AMC. So this is just one example of a variety of ways that an AMC could be designed, and just one example of how it might influence that table that we keep coming back to about what the key gaps are that an AMC faces and whether or that carbon removal faces, and whether or not an AMC would be able to fill those gaps. So I'm now going to pass it over to Daniel to do our last section of the presentation and close us out.
Thanks, Isabel. So this section is focused on what the benefits are for different stakeholders in society for getting involved in an AMC, and also the ways in which those stakeholders can support it. Obviously, a hugely important stakeholder here is governments, right? This is a multi-governmental AMC for CDR, not a corporate AMC for CDR. At the end of the day, for this AMC to scale and have the impact that we articulated, multiple governments will need to step up and fund it. However, and if you could go to the next slide, please, there are many benefits to governments to getting involved in this process at the design and exploration phase. In our view, governments can and should be motivated to begin engaging now. They can pretty quickly gain visibility into the frontier of carbon removal technology development, right? Explore ways to shape this new industry, secure a leadership role in it. They can engage with peers and experts in other governments. They can engage with other actors participating in the AMC from private sector, academia, civil society, build valuable relationships and knowledge. And then as they progress through and move into more of a planning role and a funding role, right? That's when the benefits become more concrete and material, right? That's when you're really beginning to spur economic development, provide environmental health, resiliency benefits. And, that could either be in the country or jurisdiction that you represent, or you could be supporting economic development and those benefits in other parts of the world, if that's part of your policy objectives. And then, of course, there's important benefits at the end there around engaging in climate justice, leadership on climate action in new and important ways. So we already see governments stepping up in various ways on CDR. There's a lot of innovation happening on policy mechanisms and instruments. There's lots of momentum in every continent of the world. And we'd encourage those countries and other countries that are curious about CDR to take the first step and begin to engage with others in a conversation about what this could and should look like. Now, that said, it's not all about governments, or I should say governments are not the only people who have a role to play in making this happen, and they're also not the only stakeholders who could benefit from this. So if we go to the next slide, there's four main other stakeholders here that should act to support this. It's corporates, it's philanthropies, it's NGOs, and it's academics. Corporates can really scale the impact of this mechanism. They can, at the end of the day, they can show up and match government purchases, as we saw Google do with the US government in a sort of pilot co-procurement mechanism during the Biden administration. All right. They can also, as they're engaging in CDR, they can engage with this AMC design and development process. They can share learnings. They can advocate. And for many corporates, this is a supply side opportunity as well, right? As the market grows, more and more large companies will begin to think about what it would look like for them to leverage their existing assets and operations and infrastructure and resources to participate in this market. And by getting engaged early, again, they can help to scale the impact of this mechanism and accelerate it coming to fruition. NGOs and philanthropies also have a very important stake in this. They can activate this, they can champion it. On the donor side, there is a long, important, successful track record of donors funding the design, the operations, the setup of AMCs in global health and other domains. And then, for the larger philanthropies, we also see them sometimes step in and play a procurement role or supporting innovative financing, underwriting procurements. So, for the right philanthropy, there's a whole journey that donors could go on with this, right? From the design and conceptualization through to the launch, stand up, and then procurement and financing phases. NGOs can also play an activation role here, educating and informing governments and other stakeholders, engaging in recruitment of some of these other actors, and trying to sort of drive and coordinate some of the design and stand-up of a new mechanism. And then academics also essential, very important. They can inform how this evolves and make sure that this concept evolves in a way that is high integrity, rigorous, informed by the latest research. Insights from academia are relevant. The design of the AMC, in navigating the technical topics that will come up as it's operationalized, whether that's on MRV, diligence of individual purchases and projects, and determining perhaps where more R&D or innovation is needed in the CDR field overall. Go to the next slide. I just wanted to note that we're far from, obviously we're far from the first group to identify the relevance of an AMC to CDR. Frontier was really a sort of pioneer on that, and immense gratitude for them for everything they've done to move the field forward using that mechanism. But we're also not the only ones to be thinking now about a multi-governmental AMC for CDR. We see a recent policy paper coming out of or commissioned by DG Climate, that's there on the top right, exploring an EU purchasing program for permanent CDR, which covered a range of options for how the EU could engage in purchasing instruments to support CDR, but certainly pooling purchase commitments from multiple member governments was one of the options. Combining that with leverage from corporates was an option in there as well. There was just this last week a new paper by the Tony Blair Institute for Social Change on scaling the carbon removals economy, which surveyed a range of instruments, but it also included this concept. So I would say, the fact that multiple people are surfacing this concept at this time suggests to us that, there is a real need and relevance here. And obviously that's just part of the puzzle, it being needed, but it suggests to us that the concept is timely and worth exploring. So what next? I mean, the ask and the message here is pretty simple. If you go to the next slide, essentially, if you are interested in playing some role in helping to make this concept come to life, whether you are, you're in government, you're in a corporation, philanthropy, NGO, or academia, we would love to hear from you. We're frankly not quite sure of what role we would like to play in this long term, but we do know that if we can help bring together a community of people who are interested in making this happen to start, then we would love to do that as a next step. So please reach out to us if you have some interest, and we will, we're here to bring that community together, keep growing it, and try and move this concept off of the page and into real life action. All right, thank you very much. I think I'll turn it over to Matt now for the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And like you said, we are a bit ahead of schedule, or a minute ahead of schedule. So well done, team, and ready to take some questions. So there's been some reminders in the chat, but we do have this time carved out to address your questions as a panel. So please submit them, and we'll start talking through them. The first one I'm seeing is, what is the technology readiness of CDR approaches if an AMC was created? And I think I'll take a first crack at that. And note that AMCs can be applicable to a variety of TRLs, technology readiness levels. We saw in the vaccine space that an AMC sparked innovation to create new solutions, entirely novel technologies that didn't exist before. And that is one thing that could be a great use of an AMC in carbon removal. We also see the potential for an AMC for carbon removal to move existing technologies down the cost curve. So increase deployment, and by doing that, spur deployment-based research and economies of scale that make existing carbon removal technologies more affordable and support the development of improved measurement for these technologies. So in short, it could be applicable to a variety of TRLs, and it will depend on the interests and goals of the involved stakeholders of what TRLs the AMC concept should support. All right, so I think let's talk next about, has RMI engaged with any governments directly related to this discussion paper? And if so, what has the reaction been? And I'll hand it to Noah, I think, to address that.
Yeah, happy to take that. We haven't talked to folks directly about this paper. It came out just a week or so ago, but we have solicited a lot of feedback on this topic directly. What I would say is that we've primarily focused on OECD governments for feedback. And I think there's almost unanimous recognition that carbon removal is critical for climate strategies and meeting climate targets. And so governments are all thinking about how to do more carbon removal policy. They're all keen to work together because they realize that they could go farther and more effectively if they're working in collaboration. But I think the challenge is, how do you figure out how to do that within national national political and economic constraints? I think there's a lot of fiscal headwinds that a lot of countries are facing. It's not as easy to just write $100 million checks for something like carbon removal purchasing in a way that it was a lot easier when interest rates were lower, when countries were in a stimulus mode. Um, and also figuring out how countries can collaborate when they've already started carbon removal policies, but many of those are different, as we've heard. Some are thinking about ETS integration, others about tax subsidy, and every combination in between. And so how would they actually work together on this? And then, of course, the last dimension is particularly tricky around countries really want there to be direct benefits to their own economies when they do this. And so, how they structure that while also working in collaboration is really important. It's something that is notably different when we think about public health and vaccines, is that there already was money designed to support international public health efforts, and countries were just figuring out how to do that. This requires that we make that commitment to supporting international carbon removal projects, in addition to figuring out how to do that. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Noah. Moving on to our next question. I think I'll ask Daniel to jump in on this one. What role can a CDR startup play to help?
Thanks for that question. I mean, first of all, we'd love to hear from you as well. So please let us know if you are interested. I think validating that a mechanism of this kind would be commercially important to you now, right, is very useful. Providing additional information on what exactly would be valuable about an AMC would help inform the design, right? I mean, you read the paper, you see that there's many different design choices and trade-offs that could be navigated, right? And I think an important factor in working through those design choices for anyone that's trying to build this will be what the real-time needs are of companies that are trying to commercialize the technology right now. And then finally, I would say that, you know, there's an important thing that startups can do probably better than NGOs, donors, governments or corporates, which is, you know, depending on where you're at as a startup, right, you may be more attuned to what is happening in the specific geographies that you're trying to operate in, and what the appetite is in that geography for engaging on CDR, right, than anybody else. And so I think reflecting on, you know, whether you're seeing curiosity, movement, momentum within government or civil society in the geography that you're in, right, and trying to help sort of, you know, flag that to the rest of the CDR community and bring those people into the global conversation would be incredibly valuable. So, you know, flagging that it would be relevant, sharing how exactly the AMC could be most relevant and helpful, and then trying to bring new global actors into the global conversation.
All right, thanks, Daniel, and thanks everyone for all these questions. We're getting lots of great questions, so please keep them coming. Next, we'll go with: does an AMC always imply the commitment is from a buyer's club? If not, how is an AMC different from other futures contract vehicles? It's an interesting question, and I think given the strictest definition of an advanced market commitment, it would likely be interpreted as commitments from a set of buyers to support the emergence of a technology that does not already exist. What we've done for CDR is observed that an AMC or commitments to demand of some kind can be useful for the field, both for developing new technologies and for supporting existing technologies, which is potentially more flexible than the strict AMC definition. And we saw in the work that the EU did on demand supports that there are a variety of different mechanisms that can support the development of CDR. One thing to note about the work that we've done is we looked at AMCs specifically, but a lot of the analysis of the design decisions that would need to be made could be applied to other related or similar mechanisms, or just to futures contract vehicles or other future purchase mechanisms more generally. So we think this analysis is applicable both to within a strict definition of an AMC, but also to demand supports more generally.
Yeah, Matt, and I can just add, in some ways, things like the 45Q tax credit in the US for direct air capture are an advanced market commitment. The US government has committed to purchase as much direct air capture as the field can provide at that $180 a ton. Obviously, that's not sufficient to actually stimulate that type of growth on its own. But I think that really shows that an AMC is really just a concept. What it needs to do is convince the private sector and convince the private capital that we can have a real market here. So if you invest today, if you build projects, there will be supply. And that type of sort of cycle can be self-reinforcing. And it doesn't really matter what the ultimate policy mechanism is at the end of the day, as long as it achieves that goal of convincing the private capital that they need to invest now and make that supply available and come down the cost curve.
And to add in a related question, someone asked, why not use carbon contracts for difference? And I think the same conclusion applies. That is another type of mechanism that can support demand. And this analysis and our thinking about future work would not necessarily preclude those any other kind of mechanism that can achieve those ends. Okay, so next we'll go with how can philanthropies and NGOs help with this effort? Daniel, I think you spoke to this a little bit during the presentation, but can you maybe go over that again or elaborate a bit?
Yeah, I'd say the short answer is activating a process by which governments and others come to the table and begin to explore this, right? NGOs can come together to articulate the case for this in different geographies to different stakeholders. Donors can do the same. They also have convening power, which is very useful, right, at this stage of the process. Playing a funding role to fund the design and initial convening, but also signaling that they are interested in this and potentially could stay engaged through subsequent phases, I think is very powerful, right? And helps signal to other stakeholders that this could have potential. So very important role for philanthropies and NGOs. If there are any on this call who have interests, we would love to hear from you.
Okay, next question we've got. Do you all think an AMC has the potential to kickstart economically supported markets that help CDR become commercially supported beyond government funding or policy? Isabel, do you want to take the first pass at this?
Yeah, sure. I can take a first pass and then feel free to chime in with anything else. I would say that that yes, the argument of this paper is that an AMC is a bridge for a lot of the key gaps that we've identified. And I think especially having governments kind of play that role um, to scale the industry and to move it further along, it definitely brings it to a place um, where it is economically viable, potentially outside of an AMC. So I think that some of the key gaps that we identified, for example, are deployment, innovation, measurement readiness, standards. So these are all gaps that we believe an AMC could help to fill and kind of bridge that gap then for the CDR industry and market broadly to become more mature and and economically viable. So that's my first pass at it. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would say that an AMC has the potential to surface innovation, surface new innovative pathways, and then to help people understand or experience how those different pathways and approaches act in the real world, not just in terms of their cost per ton of CDR performance, but what they actually do and deliver in different settings for different communities, right? And there's a wide range of CDR approaches. If you take a comprehensive view and involve everything that could be possible on forests and farms and working lands, everything that could be possible in ocean-based CDR, you could envision how there's a bunch of activity happening, which is removing carbon from the atmosphere, but it's also remediating waste. It's strengthening soil health. It's remediating acidification of the ocean. It's helping to prevent forest fires, and these are all things that once communities feel them and experience them, could potentially be standalone ways. You could motivate standalone ways of paying for CDR outside of direct government procurement or policy support. So I think it's possible that the AMC will open up lots of opportunities that we can't see yet for motivating market development or industry development outside of direct government performance. That said, that is probably not the primary goal that we are aiming for, right? The primary goal is to bridge a gap between where we are now and more scaled policy support, because our hypothesis is that based on what we see now, for CDR to scale eventually, you need scaled policy support of some kind. And a very important part of the thesis here, or the theory of change, is that by launching a mechanism like this and building up the numbers of deployed projects, the number of industrial participants, the amount of investment flowing in, you grow the constituency of people that are invested in the CDR industry and stand to benefit from it being scaled, and that strengthens the odds of passing policy in many geographies, because you've got a larger political coalition to back that. So ideally, I guess AMC would open up both things: more scaled policy support and new new economic pathways for scaling CDR that don't rely on government support.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks everyone for the really active and engaged Q&A. I think we have time for one more question. And then we'll use the last 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up. So last question we've got is, how does RMI think about some of the design considerations? Is there anywhere that you've identified the best choice for a design option? Isabel, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much. I would say that kind of as mentioned in the presentation, the ideal design of an AMC really depends on what the goals of the AMC are and who is coming together to design it and what their specific goals are as well. So it would depend a lot on the situation and the hoped impacts. What I would say is that we've thought a lot about the 100 design options that I mentioned in the presentation and the trade-offs of each one of those design options. So kind of given specific goals in mind, I think that there would be different, ideal designs of an AMC that just would depend on what those end goals are. Whether the main goal is to innovate as much as possible, whether it's to focus on specific CDR approaches, whether it's to focus on garnering as much AMC membership as possible. Like there's a variety of goals that could be pursued, and I think the design would vary based on that.
Okay, thanks, Isabel. Can we put the last slide back up on the screen? Great. So thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on our discussion paper, Securing a Future for Carbon Removal, the Case for a Government-Led Advanced Market Commitment. We're very happy to share this important work with you, and we also want to, again, thank all the contributors to this report and everyone who reviewed it and provided feedback. A reminder, we've been recording this session, and the recording will be posted on the event page. That's the same one you used to register for the webinar within 24 hours. The QR code that's on the screen right now will take you straight to that event page that you can return to as resources are added over the next day or so. As another reminder, if you are interested in helping us make this happen, please reach out. We're looking forward to being in touch. And thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.